My name is Carissa, and I wanted to welcome you to this MasterControl Expert Series presentation. You're about to hear from a subject matter expert who will provide valuable information from their industry and work experience. Plus, to enhance your educational opportunity, we have set up a LinkedIn group where you can join the conversation, ask questions, and interact with the presenter. This is an amazing opportunity to get direct access to an expert in their field. And now, the presenter.
Hello, my name is Ken Peterson. I'm with MasterControl, their Director of Quality and Compliance Services, and welcome to the second presentation in a three-part series on quality event management and the CAPA system. Today's presentation, Taking Effective Actions. As we look at where we want to go this time, let's take just a moment to calibrate with where we've come. Last time we looked at the quality event management process and focused on CAPA. Here you can see that in these yellow, orange, and brown colors. We talked about quality events and how those were the inputs, the feeder system, to the quality event management process. They were represented by things such as deviations or complaints, nonconformances. We then looked at how they fed forward into the staging ground for CAPA, or sometimes referred to as issue review, and how we used a risk-based filter to make key decisions and decide what action to take or to move it into the formal CAPA process for an investigation. We're going to focus primarily on three core areas where action is needed. As we move towards that, we don't want to lose focus, however, that the main reason for a CAPA system is to arrive at a solution. So we need to arrive at a solution. If we're not arriving at a solution, it really just is a waste of time. However, as we get to that solution, there's two key ingredients: expertise and process. Expertise is the wisdom, it's the experience, it's the knowledge that you bring when you come to resolve the situation, and process is the methodology. It's how you go through step A and B and C and get to D, and D's a good place every time. So let's take that and make sure that we're navigating this maze, making it easiest on us, and arriving at the most successful solution. Just as in our last presentation, we're going to use the best practices that we deployed for a CAPA system. You'll remember that a key process, having a methodology that the second one will accept all inputs, whether it be a complaint or an audit finding, all the different inputs, all the different deviations that can come forward is really key. We then take those and we use a risk-based filter in order to avoid death by CAPA. We want to make sure that we're spending our time where we're going to get a significant return, and also where we're using good compliance skill set knowledge to make sure that we stay within the CAPA regulation that's imposed upon us. We also want to make sure that we're efficient. That means we're going through a lot faster than we used to, and that we're effective, that we get the very best action possible. As we continue to look then at the CAPA process, we're going to pick up with the first key ingredient to being successful, and that is having the right action or the best solution. And there is better solutions than others. We'll talk about how to arrive at the most significant one. And then we'll also start to set the stage for the third presentation, which delves more into meaningful analytics and how we use this information well past this immediate situation several months into the future to make other key decisions. In essence, friends, in our flow chart here, we can see again that yellow representing those key inputs. That input might have been represented such as a complaint. And we're going to look at key decision points, 3 of them to be exact, through this process. The most simplest place to make a decision is at the department level, wherein that, for example, complaint may have been initiated. If we can resolve that with a correction or a containment action because it doesn't warrant further investigation, we want to do that previous to taking it into the formal CAPA process. As we move forward, we can see that in that lighter orange color, what we have primarily as an action that we'll examine will be a containment action. This action addressing, again, primarily the symptoms or the immediate response to what has gone wrong. And then, as warranted, we take it into the darker orange color, and we'll be talking a good deal today about the right corrective or preventive action. And importantly, how do we deploy or implement those actions effectively? Given that our focus is on the actions and what action we should take, we then consider that risk scale and the color coding that then gave to us. You'll remember that the green was acceptable, the yellow was undesirable, and the red was unacceptable. And these three colors help us determine what kind of action is going to be needed based on the quality event. That is very helpful because if we know where we have to end up, then we can deploy the right action in a safe and effective manner. Let me give an example. Let's look at the first one. If we have something that's coming up green, we actually have the opportunity to take no action. And we consider no action as an action in the sense that we are still watching it, we're recording it, we might track it, but we're waiting to actually deploy some kind of action. The next one is where we're starting to see some yellow in that scale up above. And we look at corrections or a containment action. Now folks, bear in mind that a containment action is immediate in its scope. It deals with the existing situation, and it allows us to take the symptoms, bring them into a manageable area, and be able to operate within our targets, our production quotas, whatever it is that we're looking at, the safety, the regulatory elements, and do it in a safe manner. We're not doing an investigation. If we move forward and we want to know what the root cause is, then we would have a corrective response. And a corrective action then needs to eliminate the root cause. There is a one-to-one relationship there. The key being reoccurrence. We're keeping that cause from reoccurring. And then as we advance further up into the right corner of that chart up above, we would then be looking at situations where preventive action is also needed, where we would look into the future. So corrective action focused on the past, something went wrong, we're going to do something about it. Preventive action focuses on the future, something could occur, is likely to occur, and we're going to determine what that potential problem is, its likely causes, and how we would intervene before it does indeed occur. So we would be dealing more with occurrence versus reoccurrence. Selecting the best action, selecting the best solution. If we're in the CAPA process, we will be at a minimum looking at root cause removal. And so our solution must eliminate the root cause. Some things that we have to consider. First, do I need several components to achieve complete removal? Bear in mind that many situations today are complicated, they're complex. And so we may have several variables that make up that corrective response. And as we look at those different variables, we need to make sure that we've got all of them tied into a nice bundle as we push that action forward. We must also look at, will this solution completely remove the cause? We hope that it will, but occasionally there might be some intervening factor that it does not allow complete removal. Perhaps the best we can do is 90% or 85%. We then have to ask ourselves, is this good enough? Will this take us into a place where we are still in a safe harbor? And so there are times where we may not be able to remove entirely the root cause. The next one is, will my solution cause other problems? Bear in mind that a corrective action is oftentimes a change. And we're going to need to consider, how will this change affect other elements downstream in the process? How will this corrective action involve other departments? We're going to have to consider how this solution may potentially cause other problems. And we'll talk about prevention as one element to deal with that later in the presentation. And then lastly, how smart is it? We're going to give you a wonderful little formula called SMART, which if used will nearly ensure that you will come up with a good corrective response nearly every single time. Selecting the best action. Well, the first thing that we need to consider is every solution has a cost. As we identify the constraints, the regulations, the requirements, the restrictions, there are certain things that are absolute, that we cannot manipulate or get around, and we have to know what they are. It's a good idea to bring the right individuals in that might help us see past a blind spot so that we can recognize these. But we also must consider things such as budget, timing. How fast does this have to be deployed? Do we have a little bit of time because perhaps the line is shut down and we've got some reprieve there? Production requirements, regulatory requirements, customer requirements. These can be elements that are imposed upon us that we have to take into account when we select our path forward as well. It's easiest for me to determine the best action by thinking of the 1, 2, 3s. The first one is know your criteria. As I mentioned earlier, some of these are absolute. They may be deal breakers. They may be things that, in my mind, are limits. They could be mandatory criteria such as the requirements or the restrictions, the regulatory constraints. And then you have desirables. Desirables are elements that would help you with the performance or the acceptance, make it easier for a user to deploy this particular action. It might be something that would be less expensive versus highly expensive. And so desirables also feed into our selection process. Second, very key, is acceptance. Who do you need to involve? Have you brought the right team together? Who needs to be in this process of building this action or deploying and accepting the action? So we will talk about who, and acceptance is a key element. The third one, what is the most important? Now both are important, speed and effectiveness. However, sometimes, given the situation, we have to move quicker and we might have a potentially less effective solution because of speed. If I had to pick one, generally I let effectivity trump speed. But sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. One of my favorite sports is football. If you think about a situation, perhaps the end of the game, you've got 30 seconds left, we're down by a couple of points, we've got a great team, they're on the line, everybody knows what it is they're supposed to do, but we also have an opposing team, and that somewhat represents the environment, the customer, management, product quotas. There's other things that are influencing this action that we want to deploy. Well, obviously in this situation, we want to hike the ball quickly, put it in the right place, have the right individual hit it with his foot, send it in the right direction so that it splits the uprights and we win the game, or our action is a successful action. However, if we're too slow getting the ball in the right place and those outside influences come in and collapse our action, we'll never get an opportunity to be effective. However, if we go too fast and we fumble the ball or make a bumble, we may not be able to get the foot in the right place. And so typically it's a balance, but we have to consider both speed and effectivity if we're good at deploying the action. However, it all leads up to what? You got to make a decision. And sometimes there's a few different alternatives that will get us to the same place. Other times there's not. We just have one path to chase. Timing is important. However, that action, bear in mind, must always satisfy the absolutes. Those are elements that you cannot fudge or manipulate. And if it doesn't, you need to adjust that action so that it does. Otherwise, you're just going to have potential problems, an upset and frustration later in the CAPA process as you deploy it. Try to have your action so that it meets as many of the desirables as possible. And listed with number 3, if you've got several very expensive actions that you may have to deploy or are considering amongst them, rank your desirables so that you can look at them for further separation and clarification. Sometimes bring a team in or take them to management and get management's input or your customer's input or your supplier's input so that you can make the best decision with that clarification. And lastly, always, if it's a high impact situation, consider any risks inherent in that action or that solution. Now is a better time to think about potential problems and what we might do with them than later on after they've already occurred and we're trying to mitigate the impact or put the fire out. As we make the right decision then, the easiest thing to do, I think, is to use this SMART. Now SMART has worked for me, perhaps it'll work for you. SMART actions are these: specific, measurable, aligned, realistic, and time-bound. Let me give you some examples. By specific, we're talking about, is it articulate? If I read your action, your corrective response, is it easy for me to understand what you're trying to accomplish? Are you measurable? Have you written this so that I can put it into verification and validation, and I'll be able to easily confirm that this action is indeed solving the problem? Is it aligned? Earlier we said that it must have a one-to-one relationship with that likely cause. I need to see that this action relates specifically to this cause and not to some other tangent that you might have talked about. Now, realistic. What makes you believe that you can actually accomplish this? Have you done this before? Do you have the resources? Is the time frame realistic? And that leads us to time bound. Do you have a date of acceptance or a time frame in which you want and expect to have this occur by? Let's take a look at a couple examples. I pulled a few from recent audits where we've had a situation to gather some real information. First one, adjust change control SOP to reflect new company standard. As we look at the SMART criteria, is it specific? Well, we know it is change control. It's an SOP. I'm not really sure. Is it measurable? No. Can I align it to the cause? I get an idea what it might be attached to, but it's nebulous. It's vague to me here. Is it realistic? Hard to say. Certainly there is no time-bound element to this first example. It can be better. Let's look at another. Let's say that you have a manufacturing process, and within that process, throughput's increased, and because of that production, you have a new pump, or excuse me, an old pump, or a pump within the process that isn't able to keep up. And so we've determined that to solve that deviation, we're going to install a new pump motor on line 3 by January 6, 2014. How are we doing? Well, it is more specific. We understand it's a new pump motor. We know where it's going to be put, line 3. We do have a time element, January 6. I feel a little better if I went and found the likely cause, I could probably find a better relationship to this new pump motor versus the old pump motor. So it's getting better. I'm not sure just how measurable it is. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more detail in this particular statement. Redesign chemistry of vial rinse to accommodate new vial size. Once again, we could go through the SMART process. We see that the time element's missing. The specifics, they're getting better. It likely is aligned to something that had this rinse solution degrade or go awry. I could probably easily go find that. But the point here that we're trying to get at is, are we building these such that at least 4 of the elements are coming to bear and we're getting better in our articulating of that corrective response? Once we feel better about that, we then need to document it in our process. Obviously, if we've got an electronic system demonstrated by the MasterControl process here, you would then put that in the appropriate place. If you've got a paper system, you put it in your paper system. No matter what you have, you're going to put that action in so that we can see it clearly in the system. And then as we move forward in the process, we might also have a need for preventive action. So let's talk a little bit about preventive action now that we understand corrective quite well. Preventive action is a different type of action because, as earlier we said, it focuses on the future. Now, with the future, we want to look at potential problems, and it's always a good idea to consider prevention. But let me give you a couple of things through the regulatory agencies and through some of the different standards that we should at least consider. If we look at the first one here, how will my corrective action affect the process or any other aspect of use downstream? Bear in mind that if we link back to the corrective action, we said that that corrective action is, in essence, a change. And that change likely will cause a ripple downstream. And so we need to consider, are those ripples or those major waves? And if they're potential problems, it would be worth our time and effort to uncover them now and treat them as a preventive component to the CAPA process. Another one is we want to take this knowledge that we're acquiring as we go through this corrective response, and if we can, let's take this expertise, this experience, and apply it to a problem that could occur in another similar likely place. Let me give you an example. Back to that pump motor. Well, I know this situation well enough to know that line 3 had that increase in throughput. but there were 10 lines. Line 6, 7, and 8. Their throughput was coming up near to where line 3 is. What does that mean? That means that 6, 7, 8 are going to experience the same problem in short order. We don't want to wait for this situation to occur and we put it in another CAPA and we take it through the CAPA process. Let's use a little common sense here. Let's apply what we've learned from this situation to those other 3 lines and let's treat it as a part of this CAPA. That would be smart. Another one would be, do we see any potential problems that are likely to occur that should be addressed at this time? Bear in mind, as you pull this collective expertise together, as you do your critical thinking, as you look at different options, you're oftentimes going to see something that you might not apply in this particular CAPA, but you could have a resolution to a problem that you could treat in your continuous improvement process outside of the day-to-day mandatory CAPA system. You would want to take a note, put it over there, and handle that in your quality management system. That, again, would be a smart use of preventive thinking. And there are several others, but these 3 give you at least a few good ideas to consider. Let me give you an example. We're going to take something a little bit offline that I hope everybody can relate to. Let's say that you run a hotel and one of your concerns is a fire. Indeed, you've had fires before and you've done CAPAs on those fires. And you've got a good sense of what causes the fires. In fact, there's a lot of research that's been accumulated through the years, and we could even go back into last year's report and we could determine what many of those likely causes are. One thing that we need to determine, or consider at least, is timing is everything when we look at prevention. So if we look at prevention, we would want to think ahead of time, what are the potential problems? That way we could then say, well, let's use some expertise. What were the likely causes? We could use research. We could use some pre-existing CAPAs. We could use some of those reports. And it just so happens that one of the most likely causes is candles. Now candles, when I first saw this, I thought, well, gee, it's got to be smoking, or it's got to be a terrorist activity. It's got to be something other than candles. Candles actually happen to be the #1 cause last year. And as you think about that, they bring the candles in, maybe for a special event or a special occasion, and that candle goes awry and it starts a fire. What would be the cause of that? Some of these hotel organizations, particularly a couple that I studied out down in Latin America, have done things as simple as ask at the front desk, do you happen to have a candle for a special event? And they collected those candles and then gave them back as the people checked out. That simple action reduced fire in those hotels by over 40%. That is significant. We also could think of the likely causes of smoking. We could think of the likely causes of other issues. And we would want to then identify those causes and say, what could we do to drive the probability out or eliminate that likely cause altogether, thus keeping it from happening and ever getting the problem. And thus, timing is very important because we want to do this ahead of time, not after the problem has already occurred. Another element to the preventive action is examine each cause and identify how you would prevent that potential problem from occurring within your specific CAPA that you're working on. So this would be related back to the potential problems that you've identified and make sure then that you make them part of your action plan. Lastly, select those high impact areas. If you've got several, you can't work on all of them. Take and select those where there is a significant impact and then try to reduce the possibility of occurrence as best you can. Drive it into a more manageable area. Well, folks, now that you've got your corrective and preventive actions, whether simple plan or detailed plan, you now have to get these things implemented. So how do we go about getting them accomplished? A couple of things to consider. First, communication is very important. Who's this action going to move forward to? Who needs to be in the know? Does a customer have to give some feedback or input? Make sure that we're considering who has to be in the know and who we need to communicate with. The next one is required resources. Will we have to involve other departments? Are we going to need to be able to bring in resources perhaps in a situation where we have to acquire them or even purchase them in order to deploy this? You want to look at, Do we have the resources available to pull this off? Third, approvals. Who needs to be in the approval process? Is it immediate management? Can I approve this myself? Or, because of budget, does this have to go up to maybe a senior vice president? Do we have to have regulatory approval or oversight approval? Do we need to get our physician to approve this? Make sure you're considering who needs to be in the approval process. And then a timeline. When does this need to be accomplished by? Let's make sure that we're meeting that speed factor, the efficiency factor, and not going too far past that timeline such that we start impacting other things negatively as we roll this out. Another thing to consider in the timeline is leaving CAPAs open too long. If we don't deploy in a quick and timely manner, what we in essence do is leave ourselves open to a negative audit because our resolutions, our solutions are too slow to deploy. And that's not a good thing. That's never a good thing. As you can see here once again, on the document, one of the things that is good to have in that document is a section where you actually check in with your customer or supplier. In the MasterControl process, you can see that here is an opportunity for that to occur and for the customer to actually accept the corrective action or to provide input, something that I don't always see in other organizations' CAPA process. As we move forward, and as we look at collective wisdom, what does some of that collective wisdom suggest? Well, it's time to plan. And as we think about planning wisdom, there are certainly a couple things that we want to avoid. First of all, and maybe the one I see the most, is simply incomplete plans. I see elements of tremendous plans. I see some great things that are thought out, and then there seems to be gaps. And I ask myself, well, how could it be so good here, and why is this gap there? We want to make sure that that plan is thorough and that it's complete. The next one, avoid unrealistic plans, deadlines that you know you can't accomplish. Unrealistic plans where the resources aren't here, they're going to be very difficult to acquire. These kinds of things make for a very difficult implementation. And then lastly, simply just not following the plan. You got a great plan. If followed, likely that solution would go off without a hitch. But not following the plan is going to give you grief because we now are, in essence, the heart of the failure itself is us. Well, as we look at the plan, it's a good idea then to focus in on a couple of key elements. You know what these are, but let me review them for just a second. A good plan should at a minimum capture these 6 things. The task should be articulated. It should be specific, just like we said in SMART. We need to make sure that there's an owner, and that owner has been communicated to, and that owner accepts it. There needs to be a due date, so there's a timeline, and that timeline needs to be not only given, but negotiated. And then when it's completed, it needs to be entered into the process so that we can have an effective audit trail and look at those completed deadlines and timelines. It needs to have an action item, and sometimes that action item, what I'm getting at here, might be several sub-items that make up a larger task. Remember, sometimes they're complicated. We might have several variables that make up that task. And then we have to have a way to launch that task, whether it be by email or through a formal automated process, or in a paper system, taking it from one desk to the other with an official handoff and sign-off. We need to make sure that it's communicated effectively, and that's a replicable process that we're following. As an example, here you can see in our process, the task description, a place for a date, due and complete. You can see the owner, you can see an action item or an ability to track and to have an audit trail due to an item, a number that's assigned to this. And then you might have several other tasks that make up this corrective response. Now bear in mind as we launch these out, you need to also consider that you may have to initiate change control. So once again, whether automated or paper-based, when we need to notify other engineers or we need to make other people aware within our procedures that this change, this corrective action is going to have impact, that it revolves around them, we need to follow our operating procedures and initiate change control when required. Friends, I've enjoyed sharing with you this information on developing better actions and better solutions within the CAPA process. Remember, there are essentially 4 basic actions. One is as simple as no action. Another one is focus more on the immediate situation. We call that a containment or a correction, sometimes referred to as an immediate action. But it focuses on the symptoms, eliminates the symptoms, and brings them into a manageable, controlled place. We looked at corrective action and preventive action and how to deploy those actions effectively. We used a decision-making process when required if we had more complicated or expensive or more detailed actions that needed team effort and approval. And then we talked specifically about how to effectively deploy your actions through good, sound implementation and implementation technique. I've enjoyed sharing this information with you. Next time, we're going to examine in more detail in our 3rd series, verification and validation. And that's a key ingredient. In fact, more 43s are given by our agency, the FDA, on this particular element than any other element in the CAPA process. We'll be looking at measurement and analytics and how you set them up in good, simple fashion so you can make effective decisions well past the resolution of this CAPA. And we'll spend a good amount of time looking at management review and what managers should be doing as they review the CAPA process, and not just giving a thumbprint of approval. Rather, they need to be coaches and mentors to make sure they bring the whole organization along and transfer that knowledge and that education to the organization. That completes the 2nd of the 3rd series. We hope you'll join us next time. Again, my name was Ken Peterson with MasterControl, and thank you for viewing today.
Thanks for watching. I hope you gained some insights and learned a few tips that will help you in your work. Now, I'd like to invite you to join the conversation on LinkedIn. This is a great way to enhance what you've just learned and get your questions answered. At MasterControl, we understand the value of meaningful conversation with our clients, and we're striving to facilitate these conversations. You will see a Join the Conversation link below, or click on a banner similar to this to join the conversation. We also have other MasterControl Expert Series video presentations that you can watch by going to mastercontrol.com.